The opinions expressed in this episode are those of the panelists and do not necessarily reflect the views of any of the sponsoring organisations, the journal publisher, the host institution, or Contemporary South Asia. Welcome to the Contemporary South Asia podcast, the audio companion to the journal Contemporary South Asia, published by Taylor and Francis. Each episode, we engage with scholarship that examines the politics, societies, and cultures of South Asia in their global and historical contexts. Through conversations with authors and experts, we highlight key debates, emerging research, and critical perspectives that shape interdisciplinary understandings of the region today. Our aim is to extend the dialogue beyond the page, opening the journal's work to a wider audience of scholars, students, and interested listeners. Hello, and welcome to what is a very special Contemporary South Asia podcast. Today we break away from our usual format of a one-to-one discussion with one of the journal's authors, and instead we've brought together a panel of experts to focus in on the theme of claiming or reclaiming space for academic freedom in South Asia. Our panel then comprises a range of scholars from a variety of UK institutions. Each has a specialism on a particular region of South Asia or on the South Asian diaspora elsewhere. In no particular order then, our panel comprises Dr. Madhura Rasaratnam, Dr. Ashraf Hoque, Professor Jeevan Sharma, Dr. Dineshwar Bhoi, Dr. Lareb Niaz, Professor Pritam Singh, Professor Christoph Jafferlot, and Professor Maya Tudor. A very warm welcome to all of you. Rather than introducing you myself, I think it makes sense for me to ask you to introduce yourselves one by one. So, Dineshwar, if I could start with you, please.
Thank you very much, Tom. I'm Dr. Dineshwar Bhoi. So I have done my postdoc from University of Edinburgh. Now I'm honorary fellow at the University of Edinburgh, as well as I'm teaching in a college of University of Plymouth Marjan University. So along with that, recently we have edited a volume called Caste in Everyday Life. And also I have published an article with Contemporary South Asia, Caste and Mental Health. And one more book we are just editing, Doing Caste, that has been accepted by Oxford University Press. So that is my background. Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lareb Niaz. I am an assistant research professor at the Faculty of Education, University of Cambridge. I work at the Real Center there. My PhD research focused on the role of religion in classrooms in Pakistan. And along with a colleague at UCL, Dr. Kusha Anand, I've done a lot of work on academic freedom in higher education institutions in India and Pakistan and universities as spaces of dissent. My overall work focuses on inclusion and exclusion in education, especially focusing on religion, gender, and disability. More recently, I've also been working on the effects of education suspension in Gaza and West Bank. So my ideas about academic freedom and my work on academic freedom doesn't just focus on South Asia, but also elsewhere. A lot of my work in international development has also been in Sub-Saharan Africa and in different regions within South Asia, such as Bangladesh, India, Pakistan. I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you, Sam. Good morning, everybody. My name is Ashraf Hoque. I'm an associate professor of anthropology at UCL, the UCL Social Research Institute. I work on Bangladesh and the UK. My fieldwork is in both places. Initially, for my doctoral work, I worked with British Muslims, particularly young men, in the town of Luton, which is known to be, well, was in press discourse to be sort of the hotbed for radicalization, not just Islamist radicalization, but also far-right radicalization. So Tommy Robinson's hometown is there. Andrew Tate is from there. I mean, it's a grim place when you think about it through those lens. So that led to a monograph entitled "Being Young Male and Muslim in Luton." And then after that, I moved on and did some work in Bangladesh, looking at local politics in Bangladesh, but also local politics in Tower Hamlets, which is, for some of you might be aware, is quite a controversial place because the council is run by a group of independent Bengali or Bengali heritage politicians, councillors, and the executive mayor is very controversial. He's been banned on corruption charges and has, resurfaced. So my work is translocal, if you like. I look at sort of Bangladesh politics, but also Bangladeshi politics in diaspora, particularly in the UK. And broader, in broader terms, British Muslims, because Bangladeshis are the second largest British Muslim diaspora. So thank you for inviting me.
Hello, everyone. I'm Christophe Jaffrolo, teaching at Sciences Po in Paris and King's College in London. And I'm chair of BASAS, the British Association for South Asian Studies. I'm working at the moment on three things. I've just co-edited a volume on shared secret sites, the places where people of different religions meet, coexist, cohabit, interact in South Asia at large. And my current work is on Indian Muslims. We have a group again, it's a collective endeavor to look at the different facets of the condition of Muslims in India today. The other research project I'm working on is on the diaspora and the way the Hindu nationalist forces are using, quote unquote, the diaspora. And that's mostly in the West, of course. But it's, again, a collective endeavor. And we work with Japanese colleagues who are doing the same research in Asia. And the third individual research that I'm conducting is on Kartarpur. Kartarpur being this place in Pakistan where Sikh pilgrims, but not only Sikh pilgrims, in fact, you have Muslims, Hindus, can come and visit, and from India without any visa for a change. So that's an interesting site, which is again a shared secret site.
Hi, my name is Madhura Rasaratnam. I'm an associate professor of comparative politics at City University in London. I'm also the director in a kind of voluntary capacity of a research and advocacy organization called Pearl that's primarily focused on the Tamil-speaking peoples of Sri Lanka, which is founded and primarily based in North America. So my research, my dissertation, which was now a while ago, but it's kind of where it starts, I guess, looked at how states manage or don't manage ethnic difference in better or worse ways by comparing the Tamil experience in South India and Sri Lanka and the processes through which these very divergent outcomes emerged. At the moment, my work is really focused on Sri Lanka, the processes of what's called singalization, but also the political economy of those processes. And my kind of work going forward is really kind of in that area of how what we call ethnic difference can be more or less unhappy, and the contexts and processes in which that those differences emerge.
Hi all, my name is Jeevan Sarma. I'm a professor of development anthropology in South Asia at the University of Edinburgh. I work primarily in Nepal, also in India. So my doctoral work was traveling with a group of Nepali migrants all the way to Mumbai. Monograph from that is called Crossing the Border to India. Later on, I worked on political economy of development and social change. I've been on sabbatical for the last year. I was in Nepal, actually. I returned just last month. Currently working on two projects. The first one is just sort of finished the first draft of my monograph on the Gen Z uprising in Nepal. Should come out later this year. The other project I'm working on, which is kind of based on my long-term interest on the question of labor migration from South Asia, particularly from Nepal, on the relationship between debt and health of labor migrants, particularly focusing on high rates of death of Nepali, but also Pakistani and other migrants in the Gulf. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Preetham Singh. I did my DPhil at Oriel College on centralization of Indian economy, and within that, the making of regional economy of Punjab, which was later on published as a book by Routledge called Federalism, Nationalism, and Development, India and the Punjab Economy. And then I taught in this university for many, many years. For the last 2 years, I taught in Oxford University, Oxford School of Global and Area Studies, where I was a visiting scholar at Wolfson College. I'm retired from both places now, and I have Professor Emeritus status here. And when I was here, I started a course on environmental economics. And so my areas of studies are two. One, regionally, Indian political economy and Punjab, but within the broad area of centralization and decentralization. But within economics, I'm a heterodox economist, criticize neoliberal economics from an eco-Marxist perspective, which means that even criticism of the traditional Marxism, which focuses on industrialization and growth, I take an eco-socialist or eco-Marxist position. And I'm on the editorial board of Capitalism, Nature, Socialism, published from the States. And I've recently published, my latest publication is a Routledge Handbook of Punjab Studies, co-edited with my wife, Professor Meena Dhanda, who is a philosopher and who works on caste. And that's the last one. So, but I'm also writing a book on Guru Nanak and ecology, partly because as a new take from a Marxist point of view on religion, where I don't accept the traditional Marxist understanding of religion, I look upon religion as much richer cultural source. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Maya Tudor, and I'm a professor of politics and public policy at the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford. Really worked on questions of democratic origins and democracy and nationalism, initially in a dissertation project became a book on the origins of comparatively of India and Pakistan's first decade. And then since then, I've really begun to work on questions of nationalism, how we understand it as a phenomenon. So I'm editing a special issue on how national identities change and what the conceptual and analytical drivers of that are. I'm also working on starting to work on a comparative book on nationalisms across South Asia. And one of the core insights there is that religion and work differently as markers of nationalism. I've also just recently written an article that's about to come out on the way that media shapes how we and how people consume news. Nice to be here.
Thank you so much, everyone. For listeners, my name is Thomas Chambers. I'm an associate professor of social anthropology here at Oxford Brookes, along with my colleague Preetham. And I work primarily in India on labour, migration, but also on Indian Muslims. In introducing this segment of the podcast, we are tied here, of course, to Contemporary South Asia, which is the journal from which this podcast takes its name, but also part of a broader project, I think to a degree, that is run under the auspices of the British Association of South Asian Studies, which is an academic freedom observatory, which is attempting to document and track challenges to academic freedom across the region. And on that note, I'd like to ask Christoph if you could tell us a little bit more about this particular project and how BASAS is hoping to, push back to reclaim perhaps or claim a little more space for academic freedom.
Thank you, Tom. Yes, that is something we initiated now 6 months ago in the wake of a conference that we had in December 2025 in King's College in London, where we invited people from Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka for an in-camera seminar in the first place to exchange ideas of what are the challenges you've just mentioned, Tom. And then we had a public event that was very well attended because people are concerned. People want to know. And in fact, this is the first objective of this observatory, to inform people, to have the documentation, of course, cross-checked, testimonies cross-checked, but to have more information because we don't know as much as we should. There are many things going on in the field. And for that, we have divided the website. If you surf on the BASAS website, you'll see a tab, Academic Freedom Observatory, with 4 sub-tabs. And these sub-tabs are for us 4 very relevant entry points. The first one is news from the region. So we get information from the media, from what is open source, what is accessible as open sources. We partner for that with the Academic Freedom Network, the Indian Academic Freedom Network, that has been initiated by colleagues in India, including Nandini Sundar and Naina Dayal, just to inform again people when they are not in the countries where things are happening. The second tab is analysis. Longish articles by colleagues who can document what is going on there. So you will find there a very detailed account of the situation in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, in India. We are still missing Nepal and other countries of the region, but this is kind of update on what is going on. The third one is about UK. What does it mean for UK-based scholars to face attacks on academic freedom in South Asia or in South Asian studies? One thing, of course, we have started to document is access to the countries. And we need to know more about the problems we are facing to have access to the countries where we are supposed to do fieldwork. So what you will find there is a survey that we will conduct every year with few questions, completely anonymous. You can't be traced, but it's important for you to speak and say, here are the problems I'm facing. So in 2025, the survey was responded to by 58 people. And we are releasing the results of the next survey in the BASAS conference in SOAS in September. So you're most welcome to respond to the questions, because it's very important to know what are the problems we are facing. And now, year after year, things may change. It's a kind of index, if you want. There are many indexes already. That's a different one. It's much more qualitative than quantitative, but if we have good numbers, it will help. And the fourth tab is testimonies. Everyone is welcome to testify the problems he or she is facing regarding this question of academic freedom. So if you look at this, you will find, if you look at this tab, you will find a really interesting testimony by Filippo Osella, who, in a very detailed manner, explains how he has been deported immediately after landing in Kerala for fieldwork, what happened subsequently. The court case is still on, but Filippo is losing hope in the Indian. And many people have experienced similar misadventures, prefer to remain silent, thinking that they may be able to get back to, in that case, India, but it can be other countries. Well, we think that to collectively show solidarity with the victims of such things, and secondly, to somewhat put pressure on the countries which are inflicting this kind of punishment to scholars, is another way to achieve the same end, and probably a more effective modus operandi. So yes, try to help us as much as you can by spreading the word, by responding to the question of the survey, by really sending us. There is of course a BASAS email address. Any information you think useful, because once again, to share information is the first objective of this Academic Freedom Observatory, and to help the people in the countries, because of course it goes without saying, UK-based scholars are suffering. Those who are in these countries are suffering much more, and this is exactly what we are going to speak about, I suppose, now, Dom.
Thank you so much, Christoph. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is very much part of the the context we're going to be considering today, and we're placing our sort of discussions within that broader project. But also, I wanted to sort of begin the session, I guess, by kind of surveying the room a little bit in terms of getting a sense of the sort of regional specialisms that each of these very distinguished scholars we have together here have regarding their particular work and research. In that regard, then, Ashraf, I wonder if I could come to you actually and just ask you to give us a little bit of a sense of the current state of play in Bangladesh. We'll talk about your connected research in the UK in due course as well. But to begin with, we've of course seen tremendous upheavals in Bangladesh over recent years. A bit like Nepal in a way, we've had a kind of Gen Z type uprising, but somewhat differently configured. We've had very significant changes in government and so on. These sort of events, of course, are going to interplay, but also there's a longer history there to sort of be aware of as well. Now, we can't do all of that in a couple of minutes, but in a nutshell, if you give us a little bit of a sense of the current state of play in terms of academic freedom within the Bangladeshi context.
Sure, thank you. I mean, I should have really plugged a co-authored book at the top of my introduction, but there's a book called Mafia Raj, The Rule of Bosses in South Asia, which documents a lot of what you were asking for, Tom, in the Bangladesh context, because there's myself and Professor Ariel Rood, who contribute. In a nutshell, I mean, it's going to be difficult in a nutshell, but Bangladesh, since the sort of restoration of democracy in 1990 and onwards, has transmogrified into a party state, or what some scholars call a partyocracy. And essentially, the constitution as it works is based on a winner-takes-all principle. So it's first past the post, British colonial legacy. But how it sort of works in practice is that the ruling party basically takes over all public institutions, including public universities, which I'll come on to in a second. But also that the other way that the ruling party sort of maintains its very repressive control, if you like, on society is through various acts of lawfare. So passing law and legislation is really important for the ruling party, whoever it may be. I mean, it's a structural issue. It's not just one particular party that has been responsible for this. And they passed laws in order to, but they politicized the law, basically. They weaponized the law in order to control and implicate political opponents, essentially. So this began way before the Army League, were toppled. We had a law, the ICT law in 2006, which was introduced by the then BNP Jamaat party. So this was broadly a right-wing alliance that governed Bangladesh from 2001 to 2006. And at the end of their tenure, they introduced this law. It was a very controversial law because what it meant was that you couldn't really say anything that that hurt the state or the perception of the state. And it also included religious feelings as well. So Bangladesh is, for want of a better expression, a very religious place. So we have large minorities as well as Muslims. Muslims are the other majority. But broadly, everybody is respectful of religion, and religion is very central to Bangladeshi society. So when this legislation was introduced, it was received quite favorably. But then as it was implemented and as it sort of distilled within society. You had lots of incidents where journalists, academics, free-thinking bloggers were accused of hurting religious feelings, injuring the state. And then when the Awami League, I'm just trying to make it in a nutshell for you, Tom. But when the Awami League came in 2008-9, they introduced, they amended these laws and made them even more draconian. And their intention was ideological as well as to control the opposition. And what was interesting is they introduced this idea of correct history, or shotik itihash, as they say in Bengali, where the memory of 71, the role of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman or Bangabandhu was very central to the way that the state should be officially portrayed. And what that meant was that anybody who disagreed with the way that the Awami League had constructed their shotik itihash, their correct history, was going to be in big trouble. So this was the 2018 Digital Security Act, which was basically an online act. So any sort of online acts of dissent was punishable by 15 years, up to 15 years in prison. And it meant that even if you liked something on Facebook from London, you would have cases against you under the DSA in Bangladesh. This received heavy criticism, and they amended it in 2023 with the Cyber Security Act, which was just as repressive, really. I mean, there were, the problematic bits of legislation was still included. And then, of course, a year later, they were toppled from government. I'm mindful of the time. I'll just end on the repression that particularly happens on campus. So university campuses in Bangladesh are breeding grounds or recruiting grounds for political parties. And they operate essentially as fiefdoms for the ruling party. So the vice chancellor is appointed politically. And the student wings of the ruling party occupy the student halls. They coerce people into coming to demonstrations or to be silent and not to express dissent. There's a lot of violence. And this has actually, in a way, continued since the elections this year. So the BNP are now back in power with the absence of the Army League, which says its own thing about repression and freedom, political expression. The Army League are now banned. And since they've come in, and it's only been a few months, they have done the same thing as the Army League has done and removed all the vice chancellors of all the public universities and appointed their own people. And the circle continues, really. So I'd leave it there for now. I mean, there's lots more to say, as you can probably imagine, but it's
Ashraf, thanks ever so much. Yeah, I mean, I'll ask Jivan to come in here and give us a little bit of a sense of the Nepali sort of context in this regard as well. And perhaps it's kind of fair to say that in a broad kind of representative way, Nepal is often articulated as perhaps not having quite the same degree of challenges to academic freedom that we might see in some other contexts in South Asia. But of course, that's a rather simplistic and reductionist, kind of perspective, perhaps. So, Jivan, could you give us a little bit of a sense of the Nepali context?
Yeah, very much so. I think, what we learned about Bangladesh, I think we know there are some parallels, but there are also significant departures. I think that's what I'm going to largely focus on. I think the very important thing is Nepal has witnessed in the last 2 to 3 decades significant sort of political changes, compressed political changes that you would have seen that would have taken 200-300 years has taken place at a very short period of time. 1990s sort of restoration of multi-party democracy, 10-year-old Maoist insurgency leading to a significant shift in the Nepali state from a centralized monarchical Hindu state, into a republican secular state. A federal state took place between, say, 2006 when the peace process started, settled with the constitutional settlement of 2015. And Nepal is often touted or seen as South Asia's most open society, largely because the restoration of democracy in 1990 came with these fundamental rights, expansion of public sphere in terms of media, FM radios, for the first time in South Asia was liberalized. Private media came surfaced, and it was a vibrant public sphere where things were debated. Yet paradoxically, I think very similar to what we learned about Bangladesh, political parties very much controlled in the fashion of clientelism, patronage kind of system of appointment of, say, university vice chancellors or other government entities were very much controlled by the political parties. So we have this coexistence of a very vibrant public sphere where things are discussed, critiqued. Dissent is very much possible in that political context. Yet, institutions have largely been captured, right? Coming to much more recently, Nepal saw this big Gen Z uprising last year in September 2025. And I think what has happened, one of the grievances of the Gen Z, activist has been to do with this old men, in a specific term, 3 old men, basically running a musical chair. And one of the grievances has been around destruction of countries' academic infrastructure, the universities, right, which have been largely captured by the political elite, by those running for institutional politics, right, political parties, 3 major political parties: the Nepali Congress, um, the Communist Party of Nepal, CPN-UML, and the Maoist Party, right? I think what is really interesting is when the Gen Z, following the Gen Z, there was an election and the new government, a significantly a different form of government with a large number of, in the average age of cabinet is 38 years, which is previously over 60. The parliament has a significant number of people who are younger. And one of the first things they did was to dismiss all the vice chancellors up to the deans in the universities because they were all politically appointed, right? And that obviously has created a significant anxiety, but also how our universities going to run. Obviously, the Gen Z uprising is very much built around this, I would say, sometimes problematic idea of meritocracy, and that they are going to now have started this open competitive process by which people are invited to apply for vice chancellors um, or deans and various positions in medical institutions and so on, and they are going to make all the list of those who have applied and shortlisted and so on to try and claim this idea of transparency, right? So that's where we are actually. But the 2 things I want to kind of talk about over here is Nepal's kind of the sphere of academic life is not as vibrant, say, as you would see in the rest of South Asia. It's a big university, Tribhuvan University, with many campuses throughout Nepal, has been the most important institution, a breeding ground for recruitment with student unions and so on. And, I could go on to talk about the history of that, because political dissent was possible during the panchayat system, during the absolute monarchy, pre-1990, in the university campus. So that was very important. University campus and, played a very important role in the politics of dissent in that sense during the absolute monarchy as well, right? So now we've come a full round where university campus unions have been dismantled by this government, has basically said they are not going to allow university student unions in university campuses, and they've also dismantled, vice chancellors, deans, and so on, as if we are rewriting history in a fresh kind of slate. But I see lots of concerns sort of emerging in that. In between, we've seen a few cases. We haven't seen, there was a single case of sedition in Nepal, but that is a political actor, claiming Madhes, the adjoining area with India, trying to kind of claim that, well, self-determination, we want to kind of, be an independent sort of state, during the kind of the contentious politics around federalism and remaking of Nepal. The other significant event was when there is a kind of a commission for investigation on corruption, the very powerful constitutional institution that attempted to, there was a kind of within the kind of clientelist sort of framework trying to intimidate journalists or public intellectuals like, say, Kanak Mani Dixit. Many of you would know. He was charged by that particular department because he was raising lots of questions. Apart from that, we haven't really seen a sort of big sort of attempt by the state to try and sort of silence, politically speaking. But I think, Tom, you've talked about in your introduction something that is very relevant for Nepal is academic freedom. The question of academic freedom ought to be approached in the context of Nepal from perspective of institutions, capacity, and resources. And I'll probably come to that later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jivan. I wonder if I could come to you now, Laraib, and ask you a little bit about the Pakistani context. Like some other, parts of South Asia that we're dealing with today, of course, Pakistan has seen really significant political upheavals in recent years, which I guess is reflective also of a longer sort of period of instability that's been sort of, present throughout the nation's history at various moments in time. But I wonder if you could talk us through a little bit, the ways in which the interactions between kind of the state and questions of academic freedom may come into play there, and also to reflect a little bit on how that may be kind of intersected by questions around different sort of marginalities that might be in terms of region, that might be in terms of ethnicity, that might be in terms of gender, and so on.
I think I'll start talking about academic freedom in Pakistan by giving a personal example. I was hearing everyone talking about how they have monographs from their PhD dissertations. I actually have not published for my PhD because that's how scared I am. It's on religion, and I do have to go to the background of religion. More than the military, I think I'm going to talk more about religion that has an impact on the society and that seeps into universities and academic freedom. I mean, it's a country that was born out of a violent rupture because of colonialism, but based on religion. And so religion has had a very profound, long-lasting impact on the society, but it's also very fraught. It is embedded everywhere, in law, in education, in the media. It's pervasive. It's everywhere. And so this impact of religion and this use of religion increased exponentially in the 1980s during the reign of General Ziaul Haq, who was a military dictator. At that point, a couple of things happened. There was a ban on student unions, and there was a right-wing political party called Jamaat-e-Islami. They now have a union within all the public universities, and they have a wing called Jamaat-e-Talba. That led to an increase in the Islamization in the universities and a curtailment on any kind of dissent. Now, I'll give you some examples of how religion is impacting academic freedom in Pakistan. In 2013, two incidents happened. One was that there was a student, Mashal Khan, who was in Peshawar, and there were blasphemy allegations against it, again related to religion, and he was lynched by a mob. At the same time, in 2013, there was an academic, a Fulbright scholar, who was teaching at Bahauddin Zakaria University. There were, again, blasphemy allegations against him. He has been in solitary confinement since. One of his lawyers was shot dead. That is just how fraught the relationship is between the state, between education, and how religion is impacting every facet of it. I do not want to completely have a deficit lens. There has been a lot of improvement as well. There has been a lot of movement. Okay, not improvement, but movement. There have been student solidarity marches that have been happening since late 2019, 2020. I've myself been a part of those student solidarity marches in which students talk about dissent, who are there. And this is mostly prevalent in the public universities, because in private university, there's also a lot of inequality within Pakistan and a class system. So in private university, there's still some more academic freedom in terms of what the academics can say and what the students can say. But in the public universities, there is a big hole that the right-wing Islamic political party also has, the government's narratives also have, and the right-wing student, the union, Jamaat-e-Talba also has. But those students from the public universities have also been going out into the streets and protesting against the curtailment of their voices and the curtailment of dissent. So that has been happening. And at the same time, in the Supreme Court, there has been petition against because the student unions were banned in the 1980s. Now there has been a petition on opening them. So curtailing that ban on student unions. It's still going through the legal processes, and every government that comes in promises to the students that when we come in, we're going to lift the ban on unions, but it never actually ends up happening. But there is still some process that is taking place. But I personally, in my experience, have felt that more than even the military, the tension lies when you're talking about religion, because with the military, at least it's an organized faction, then that can have an impact on your career. But with religion, you don't know how a fellow student will react. I'll give an example again. I was at this very elite private university. I was a part of a panel on gender. And we were talking about how social norms are changing and they're not as restrictive as before. And these norms are actually not coming from religion. They're a part of the societal. And then there was a student in the audience who said that, are you trying to say that religion is actually saying that women should go out there and work? Religion is not saying that, which, by the way, is absolutely untrue, because it's again depends on your interpretation of religion, but this is how the narrative has been skewed and manipulated. And the student got so aggressive that I just went quiet. I didn't say anything after that. I was scared. The same way I was scared about publishing my thesis, because again it is about religion, and it is so fraught. So yeah.
Thank you so much. I wonder, Madhura, could we come to you next and touch a bit then on the Sri Lankan context? And again, we've had tremendous political upheavals. We're obviously still living in that kind of aftermath of conflict, which is now a long aftermath. But we've also had huge economic kind of crises in the country in recent years as well, which undoubtedly has penetrated in various ways. And a very fraught, kind of situation around ethnic tension and so on across the country that involves not just Sinhalese and Tamil communities, but also Sri Lankan Muslims and so on. So I wonder if you could give us a little bit of a sense of the current condition of academic freedom in Sri Lanka.
Thank you. Yeah, I think follow on from Larib actually, because when we think about academic freedom, we do often think about these top-down restrictions from institutions, so on and so forth, restricting what people can say. But a common thread that's coming, and particularly from Larib's contribution, and I can definitely connect that to Sri Lanka, is that it's actually bottom-up, right? That a lot of the restrictions on academic freedom are coming from social movements, long-run social processes that have that are quite conservative. We would call them here as kind of lefty liberal academics that would have, conservative views, right? But that is that is a strong strand of society in South Asia, but I would argue in the West also, and that's the context of academic freedom in the West. So just as in Pakistan, and I'll compare Sri Lanka to India, because that's the comparison that I'm most familiar with, is that the kind of the social movement that is really bigly transfigured space in Sri Lanka with singular Buddhist nationalism. It's very similar to Hindutva, and it has transformed. It's very similar to Hindutva, and it has transformed Sri Lanka starting from the 50s and 60s. So this is Sri Lanka is India's future. right? And, Indian universities have had a much longer tradition of academic freedom and, independence and, amazing quality academic work and scholarship in history and the social sciences, much of which I read as an undergraduate, right? Which is not quite the same in Sri Lanka. The work on Sri Lanka that comes at that kind of level of quality tends to come from outside, actually, right? So that movement started in the 50s and the 60s with Sinhala only, and with a kind of stigmatization of primarily Tamil academics as unfairly treating the sort of the sons of the soil, the Sinhalese, and unfair marking and all of the rest of it. And so you had this kind of exodus of Tamil academics in the 50s and 60s, and many of whom went to Singapore as Singapore was becoming. So there's an interesting connection there. And so that is the kind of the context of Sri Lanka is this very strong, and all these same processes started. The politicization of academic appointments was from the 60s onwards, and the impacts that's had not just on academic freedom, but again, maybe the types of output that are produced, right, once that happens, and the types of things. And if you speak to people from operation, you will find that these processes of where you're being surveilled and disciplined, right, in what you say, is by your fellow students, not necessarily by some outside authority, right? It's your fellow students who are disciplining you and constraining what you can and cannot say. And people in Sri Lanka from the Ceylon, as it was then, from the 60s, the 70s, have that experience, right? So the context of that is this is part of the process then that led to 3 decades of high intensity conflict. But that conflict also was not a conflict that was ever kind of substantially engaged with in terms of many of its violent impact by, right? So, the end of the war in May 2009, you have levels of violence that are comparable to Gaza, right? 70,000 killed in a space of a few months. It's probably much higher as in Gaza. And everything is the same, right? Humanitarian blockade, all the rest of it. And at the moment, the is basically on land grabs that are continuing and ongoing. But there's a kind of silence in the academic institutions on this, right? So, for example, I won't name names, but there's a recently published handbook of Sri Lanka. None of this is there. The war is not there. I looked in the list of figures just before I came, and the key figures that we worked on is levels of militarization in the Tamil-speaking areas, and in some places across the northern province, for example, there's 1 soldier for every 12 civilians. The equivalent figure for Kashmir, which is heavily militarized, is 1 soldier for 30 civilians, double the level of militarization as Kashmir. That figure is nowhere in this 400-page handbook, right? So what you get when that end comes of this bottom-up social movement is you don't actually get physical repression. You do get the appalling lynchings and the appalling, that happens, yes. But at the end, what you get is silence and exclusion, right? It's just silence. And people just forget to talk about it, right? And again, for me, there's a question of access. During my PhD fieldwork, for example, I couldn't go to Sri Lanka because it was 2008, 2009, high intensity conflict. I certainly couldn't go to the north. All of my interviews were in South India and when people came out to the west, etc. But when we did go back, last year, we went to the north and across the north, including the places by the end stages of the war happened. The silence continues. So we went to this, again, not naming names, but there was this kind of donor-funded peace museum in Kilnochi, which was a site of high-intensity conflict. And there's, I call it kind of donor, NGO, think tank complex, right, in all of these places. And this peace museum, the narratives just have nothing about the events that actually took place in that town. You can walk from this peace museum to a place where a memorialization event happens in November, on November 27th, which is a big date in the Tamil calendar. Thousands of people come to that. Thousands of people come,
Thank you so much. I wonder if I could ask Pritam to come in here. We've covered quite a swathe of South Asia so far, but of course, India, is very significant in this context. And I guess an argument that's often sort of made here is that there has been this experience of kind of backslide in the Indian context in terms of academic freedom, and we've seen lots of challenges over the years, not least the states of emergency and so on, but various other moments in time as well. But certainly, we've seen a increasing sort of problematic, I suppose, in recent years for reasons that I'm sure you'll illuminate for us, Pritam, that are that have had a significant impact. So if you could just give us a little bit of a sense of the Indian context as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Your invitation actually made me rethink about the link between my personal microevolution as an academic and the macro historical processes which took place in India. I was an undergraduate student in economics at Punjab University, Chandigarh, but I was associated with. I was arrested and was tortured, and there was a fear that I'll be killed. But partly because I did participate in violence, and even families, me, my life, I had to go through the terror of being interrogated, and then I moved to Chandigarh and JNU to do my MPhil, where I became a Trotskyist and critical of the Stalinist tradition of India's. And I was quite amazed that after I did my MPhil at JNU, which, as you said about backsliding, that it very thriving place. Some of the biggest intellectuals of the world came to JNU and talked, and some of the finest historians, economists were. As a lecturer at Punjab University, Chandigarh. Many of the people who were sitting in the selection committee, they knew me during student days. I was a Maoist, but that did not prevent me being taken into a university lecturer. Quite amazing. And when I started into Marxist economics, radical economics in the courses, supervision of dissertations, and some students, like one of my first students did a thesis on the theory of imperialism. They had never thought about those kind of topics for MPhil dissertation, and she got a distinction. She, of course, became a civil servant later on. Civil servant, but a good one, and not a corrupt one. And so I do think about this, that politically there was a period in India, if you're outside the university, you are involved in Maoist, Naxalite movement, you are likely to be repressed. There was, some of the brightest students of that generation in Bengal, in Andhra Pradesh, in Kerala, Bihar, and Punjab were killed. Many of my friends, one of my closest friends was killed also. But within the university, nothing happened. You were allowed to do whatever you do. You want to write papers, anything, so on and so forth. And my own ambition was also in the same field. I was accepted actually to do a DPhil at Oxford, Foundations of Marxist Economic Theory. And then 1984 happened, where the Indian Army went into the Golden Temple, and more than 3,000 people were with the temple. And 2 Sikh bodyguards of Mrs. Gandhi, assassinated her as a revenge against this. And then there are more than 3,000 Sikhs who were slaughtered in Delhi in 48 hours, the biggest genocide in India's post-independence history. Now that completely transformed my academic program. That I started thinking that what's the point in talking about abstract Marxism and socialism when there you are in Punjab, which is the only Sikh majority state in India. The Sikhs are roughly about 58%, and Hindus are about 38, 39, and majority of them are Dalit, but 13, 14% are upper caste Hindus, and about 2% are Muslims, and slightly less than 2 are Hindus, Christians. I started thinking about working on Punjab to employ that. And when I came to Oxford to do my DPhil, this is the subject I proposed, that I want to look upon the centralization of economic power in India and placing of Punjab within that, and centralization being linked with authoritarianism and also the attack on human rights. And it's very interesting. I mean, I never thought about it. It's your invitation, made me think about it. My proposal to transfer to DPhil experienced a problem. One of the supervisors was very happy that it's very innovative and so on and so forth. Another supervisor who worked on India felt a bit insecure about supporting this, thinking that if this thesis actually supports secession, which I wasn't supporting secession. I was supporting, my argument was about federal devolution. But it became a situation where the main supervisor said that the one who was thinking that he or she become vulnerable if my thesis goes should actually withdraw from the supervision. So that was a very concrete. I mean, your invitation made me think that was a concrete manifestation of the major economic and political power India exercises, and how a supervisor had to withdraw from the supervision of a thesis which she, did not agree with. Of course, I did that. But during that period, also, this centralization project was also linked with human rights violation, massive human rights violation. People being killed in encounters every day, and I wrote a book also on economy, culture, and human rights, turbulence in Punjab, India, and beyond, where I looked at human rights from a universal perspective, different paradigms of human rights, but also concretely in India. At that time, many people thought that, I might be at risk if I go back to India. And actually, when we came here, I and my wife did DPhil at Balliol, and we had a daughter who's 4-year-old. We hadn't thought of settling here. We had thought we'll, do our DPhil, and I already had a position. She will get it. She was a gold medalist in the university. She will also get, and we were very much rooted in the local politics. But because the situation became so difficult, many people actually, when I got a job here, they said, you should keep the job, don't go back to India. It'll be a risk. So in a way, I do think that my own personal evolution and the academic direction of my research took place was determined by these macro historical events where there was a threat on academic freedom. And then, more importantly, when the farmers' movement came here, I was one of the very few academics in the Western world, which I include Europe, UK, and America, people who had a background rooted in the agrarian tradition, but who were, capable of. I spoke on television, radio, those newspapers, and many people started telling me that you will have a problem when going back to India. You might be arrested, and because you're openly writing against the agro-business capitalism takeover through the farming laws, and farming agitation was so powerful. It was the first major struggle in India when Modi government had to admit defeat, and admit defeat in the most humiliating fashion. That he came to the sort of television, said that, I withdraw these farm laws and you go back home. They said, no, we won't go back home unless you actually pass it in the parliament. And the BJP people were furious that Prime Minister is giving an assurance and you are not accepting it. And they said, no, we don't accept it. So he had to face the humiliation of within 3 days passing the parliament before the agitation was read. But I think that I was prepared for this, that maybe one day I'll go to India I might be arrested at the airport. But I was also prepared this, and I think 2-3 things saved me. One, probably the Oxford connection, that they knew that if they arrest me, there will be a news. Secondly, I'm a Sikh. And BJP has a very strange, paradoxical relationship with the Sikhs. On one hand, they do see them as a threat, but they're also afraid of coming into confrontation and they don't want to antagonize them. Thirdly, I can't be portrayed as an ordinary Sikh because of my Marxist kind of background. So I was never questioned. But this fear was there that, if I'm writing article, and then I published 3-4 long historical researched article on this, which were published and so on and so forth. But not connected with me directly, but there was something else also who impinged on academic freedom, which is my wife. She started writing on caste, and she was chairman of a committee appointed by the Equal Opportunity Commission to make caste along with race, gender, and disability as a category which they can't be discrimination. And they recommended that caste should be, and that was the Labour government that time. And later on, the Conservative government came into power, and they came under strong pressure from the Indian government that don't recognize caste because that will stigmatize Hinduism. And also within this country, Hindutva organizations started targeting people who were working on caste. My wife came under attack. They wrote to her university that she should be thrown out of the university. She is attacking this. Of course, the university stood by her and nothing happened to her. And so it is interesting that these historical events have impinges upon academic freedom in this way. That reminds me also of Pakistan. I had a student who did a thesis with me on eco-socialism. She came from a very elite military background. She did a very good thesis. And when she finished the thesis, I told her that, why don't you publish? She says, no, I won't publish. She even went to the extent of saying that the university should not publicize that she has written a thesis. She'll come into conflict. And when we were mentioning, and because she had interviewed some army officers as a part of the interview. So those were the very concrete experiences how academic freedom came under. But it broadly fits in with my work on centralization of economic power, which had roots in the Nehruvian period, that it's not that there is a split between the Nehruvian phase and the Nehruvian phase, that I think the centralization was embedded into the Indian constitution. And I've written 2-3 papers on this. But this has been accelerated with the rise of Hindutva and the threat to minorities, threat to state autonomy, threat to federal autonomy, and so on and so forth. So I still continue with that work, and a new threat which is coming up, which hasn't affected me, but we don't know how it will affect in the future. That many of us who are British citizens, because of our birth in India, we are allowed to have a status called OCI, Overseas Citizens of India. And that has the advantage that you don't need to seek a visa to go back to India. One of our close friends, her OCI status has been, taken away by the Indian government, and some people say that you might be under the scanner. So it is the rise of these, ethnic-oriented nationalism. I was remembering when we're talking about Sri Lanka, exactly true, that how minorities come under attack. And which is happening in India. Maybe not in this session. I will also talk a little bit about how it's happening in the universities in India in terms of the academic research they can carry on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pritam. Dineshwar, I'm going to come to you shortly, but before I do so, I wanted to ask Maya to maybe just kind of give us a bit of a sort of sense of that overview. Dineshwar, you're going to give this wonderful, give us a sense of taking us more into the university campus, kind of, I hope, and give us a bit more of the sort of particularities, particularly around, considerations of caste. But before we go into a more sort of particularized context, Maya, I wonder if you could give us kind of a bit more of a kind of purview kind of picture of the South Asian context and questions about it.
Yeah, so I'm going to start by talking about trends beyond South Asia, that South Asia as a space is situated within. And because there are, I think, three forces more generally that shape academic freedom across South Asia, but they're actually not particular to South Asia. So first is, of course, democratic backsliding, and we've talked about, alluded to this in multiple of the comments so far. But what that means is that democracy is not dying through a mass arrest of opponents, through a shutdown of media. It's instead sort of 1,000 little and much more subtle cuts. And, for all of us who know the kind of parable of the frog and boiling water, one of the things that we know is that it's much harder to then find a particular moment to coordinate around response and resistance. And that's why, in a sense, democratic backsliding in its particular very subtle forms, and we can talk about it in a moment in the context of South Asia, is so difficult to address. The second trend worldwide we've seen is that we have majoritarian nationalism as a force in almost every corner of the globe. What the majority is defined by is contextually specific. But in almost every case, it's a conservative nationalism that looks backward to define a historical elite. It defines them as consistent with the boundary of we the people. And so it then uses that definition to delegitimize challenges to the government. So when that government comes to power, again, through majoritarian nationalist appeals, they get to power, and the authoritarian playbook is about a kind of systematic but slow and subtle dismantling of horizontal constraints, but also of civil liberties. And a third one, which we haven't talked, I think, so much about yet, is the enabling role of digital surveillance in making this happen. India is the case, I think, in which this is the most clearly established. I just wrote a piece in which I talked about referring to other people who had talked about the 2024 election as the WhatsApp election. 31% of Indians get their news not by going on to a social media platform, but get it sent to them via WhatsApp. And in that context, a BJP party operative is on record saying to an Indian newspaper that the grassroots institutionalization of the WhatsApp network is so strong that a message that is crafted in New Delhi can get to any part of the country in 12 minutes, right? And that is a very different environment for democratic backsliding. And in particular, it creates a particular set of constraints vis-a-vis academic freedom. So to come to academic freedom in South Asia, as I've already said, it's a broad spectrum, and we're seeing declines across a large range of areas. But I wanted to group them, and I think it's nice for me to come at this moment when most people have spoken about various countries into four domains where we're really seeing academic freedom decline. So the first is the right to research and teach what you want. So we've heard, from various of the panelists about particular domains of teaching that are off limits, sometimes through chilling effect, sometimes through students coming and protesting. That's anything to do with disappearances in the war in Sri Lanka. It's anything to do with the military, but particularly religion in Pakistan. It's anything in India to do with a site of India as a history of syncretic religious tradition. So all of these are linked to the ways in which these governments have come to power and how they understand their sort of legitimation on their power to be legitimated. So that's the first domain. The second is the right to academic exchange and information gathering. So we heard from Christophe about this incident of, a teacher who was stopped from going to Sri Lanka. That's the tip of the iceberg. There is lots and lots of, visa restrictions that won't be granted, but the ability to actually to do the work. And part of what we all do is we go to panels like this and conferences, and we learn from each other. And if people are not free to travel, not free to get visas, that constrains, our ability to learn from each other and to have universities really function as a place of alternative opinions. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, that universities are very early to be targeted almost across the board. So I'm part of the American Political Science Association has a task force on universities in an era of democratic erosion. One of the things that we're looking at is anecdotally it appears that universities, particularly elite universities, are targeted very early on. And one of the reasons that's so is because they're a site of alternative views and as a site of potential dissent. So the third is campus integrity. It's as a space that is free from intervention from governments. We've heard about Bangladeshi universities as a site of recruitment for political parties. We've heard about forcible deunionization in Nepal or an outright ban in Pakistan. So the ability of campuses, and I think this has never been fully true in South Asia, but it is increasingly less true. And I think that change is again important to signal. And a fourth domain is freedom of expression, right? So what can you as an individual say? Universities used to be places where it was a place where you were actually were welcomed. And I think it's important to say this is not limited to South Asia. This is absolutely happening in universities across the world, including in the country that we're sitting in, where there is lots of discussion about whether there's an Gaza exception to free speech. But I think it's happening both in top-down ways through appointments of aligned individuals in positions of leadership. It's questions of military and especially religion in Pakistan. So there are whole domains increasingly in which freedom of expression is off limits, and it's, I think, a very interesting domain of research to think about how that happens, because I think increasingly it's social movements, but it's also social movements intertwined with a kind of digital army that can amplify and manufacture outrage. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you very much indeed, Maya. I'd like to ask Dineshwar to come in here then, because Dineshwar, I'm conscious your own work, and you've obviously been on the podcast already with regards to one of your articles published in Contemporary South Asia, that your own work is very much focused on the university campus. And in that sense, I wonder if you could kind of take us, I guess, from, the kind of big national kind of perspective, much more into that campus kind of setting. Obviously, this is a particular campus in India, but maybe you can use that to reflect a little bit on the dynamics around kind of campuses and some of the kind of more intersectional aspects that might come into play there as well.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Professor, connecting to India's broader framework of academic freedom. So, if I say the idea of university, which supposed to be critiquing the national fault, but the idea of the university where we're supposed to engage in a critical discourse, the things in India now change. So the space in critical space is enormous when India was independent, and there are two major drives before independence. One was the nationalistic movement, another was integrating India into the unity or in. Yeah. In that discourse, when there are few people who works on nationalistic movement, starting from Gandhi, Nehru, and all, and if I see integrating communities to the India, if I say the great leader Dr. Ambedkar, then we have the constitutions how we can integrate the people. But despite of this constitutional framework, how the academic codes, if you see the space for marginal communities like Dalit tribes in the universities and how they negotiate everyday space in universities. So if I say there are some examples where the student, those who are from marginal communities, and they are engaged in the discourse, or maybe they are taking part in the protest or social movements. So their fellowship is directly got like their fellowship is stopping by the university as well as the government. So when you raise your voice, so there is no space for raising your voice because you are coming from certain marginal communities. You are getting fellowship to study, not raising voice. And in the similar way, I also come across some of the examples where a few of my participants they face interview for their jobs from marginal community from Dalit background, but the panel not select them because they are radical Dalits. So become Dalit is okay to following everything. Yes, G, ha, everything is okay. But when you raise your voice, when you started to claiming your right in the university, then you are not welcomed into the discourse, because this also I come to know when we're just discussing in an informal chat with one of the panel members. I came to know that the tag of radical Dalit is not accepted in the university. And similarly, if we see the topic you choose for the research, even if the government of India has issued and circular. So, what are the topic can be researched, even if in India as well as overseas, if it's based on caste, based on the culture, and it's just revealing their caste and caste hierarchy and the caste discrimination related things. So it is threatening their culture and pride of the nations. With the fear of that, they just issued and circular what are the topic can be researched and what are the content will be there. So in that way, so if I see how the academics goes with the nation building process, so if we see, as Professor Pritham said, there was some space to raise your voice, but since the government changed, the regime changed in India now, we have a different space where uh, we don't have a right to claim the things. We need to negotiate and think for survivals. And this is the phase where the the voice were silenced with the pressure, with it systematically, and even it leads. There are things when the student come into the protest and they claim their right. So the consequently they are expelled from the hostel and maybe sometimes suspended from the course. So then many students come to mind is also a little bit related to the university creating a mini village of caste where the everything starting from the hierarchical assignment of roles as well as discrimination, segregation is very much prominent. Even the real village is little hazy, but it is more in.
Thank you so much, Dinesh. I wonder if I could come back to yourself, Lorraine, now and ask. You've given us already quite a good sense of, the particularities of the Pakistani sort of context in terms of academic freedom, and you've also highlighted for us how that's, very much kind of an intersectional kind of experience as well. But I wonder if you could, if I could ask you then to sort of broaden that perspective out a little bit and to go in the opposite direction a little bit from Dinesh, where I guess to sort of think about the international and the global, to think about how questions of academic freedom are in the South Asian context are also connected to and reflective of broader questions around academic freedom that might be not just in the so-called global South, but in the UK and in other parts of the world as well. So yeah, I wonder if you could, if I could ask you to sort of do that work of expansion.
Thank you so much for bringing that up. I think the past 2 years, especially since the genocide started in Gaza, has really opened my eyes towards what academic freedom is, and towards the very northern lens that I think that I had before when I was looking at Pakistan and I was looking at South Asia and I was looking at the freedom of speech there. I've actually started questioning the whole idea about freedom of thought, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, because what is that? Um, in terms of just globally, I just wanted to point out two things. First, I wanted to talk about what kind of evidence is produced within South Asia, within Pakistan, that is also linked to global architecture and global hierarchies. I recently did some work on education research that is produced within Pakistan by Pakistani scholars based in Pakistani universities. And I interviewed them. I looked at what kind of research is coming out. And then what the people said was that a lot of their research is, so we've talked about government surveillance, we've talked about other kinds of surveillance, but we've not talked about the economic architecture and funding. So a lot of the academics did then speak about the fact that there is very limited funding. There have been funding cuts. There is limited support that the government can already give us. It's a debt-riddled country, so a lot of them are dependent on international funding architecture, international aid, and so international agendas. So what they're getting funding for is climate justice education and AI. Anyone who wants to do something different is actually not even getting the funding for it. So the question is not even that can I say these things or not? Do I have the architecture to even say what I want to say? Do I have the architecture to conduct research on what I need to research? And I think that is also a very important aspect in global South countries, that do they even have the funding for it? Because I know that there are people who want to write more about national identity. They want to write about caste. They want to write about religious minorities. But also, in a lot of cases, there is no funding. Again, I'm going to bring in my personal example. My PhD was on religion, but all of my post PhD work has been on disability, has been on gender, has been on other aspects of inclusion, because there was no funding in religion. But in terms of the global architecture, I also do want to focus about, I would feel really strange talking about academic freedom in South Asia if I don't speak about academic freedom here. There has been so much surveillance, there has been so much backlash. There have been students in SOAS who were protesting who have been suspended. There have been academics who have been threatened. There have been academics in the US who have been asked to leave. And the same kind of surveillance is happening over here as well. I feel like it's personally impacting my job prospects also, all of my work on Palestine. So that requires us to really think about what, and again, it's okay to call out, absolutely to call out what's happening in South Asia, but also to think about, again, the global architecture. Knowledge is never neutral. Knowledge depends on whose voices are heard and whose knowledge counts, and that depends on power. And as Maya spoke about the Gaza exception, that is such a clear thing for everyone to see, that it is we're encouraged to research, to use our voices, and to be academically free. But when it comes to Gaza, when it comes to Palestine, there is so much restriction, and there is so much backlash. I will give the example of the encampments, the student encampments that were happening in all over the UK, and in Cambridge in itself, there were these encampments that were happening. I was helping the students with it, but then there was an injunction in High Court, and there was a ban on the students protesting in the center of the university. Now, how is that academic freedom? And how can we advocate for academic freedom in the global South when this is what's happening in the global North? So I think that what has been happening since October 7th is an eye opener for everyone talking about and thinking about academic freedom.
Thank you so much. I wonder if I could come to Ashraf again now. And in a way, Ashraf, ask you to take us back from the global into more particularized context, but not to hone in on sort of Bangladesh, but to hone on the other side of your work in the UK context. And I wonder if you could just talk us through a little bit, perhaps, how academic freedom might be thought about and experienced from within perhaps the British Bangladeshi community, for example, and how, thinking about current events, in the UK, where we've seen, significant moments of violence, for example, from right-wing groups and so on, in various cities across the UK, how these sorts of factors might interplay, but also how, what sort of constraints actually are there on scholarship on South Asia in the UK specifically, and how that might sort of interplay with our broader discussion.
Insofar as the British Bangladeshi community, I mean, it's a difficult one, because there have been journalists and academics of British Bangladeshi origin, who have been who can't return to Bangladesh now because there are cases against them. under the Digital Security Act, and then later the Cyber Security Act. But what's happening? I mean, this was during the Army League period. But what we see now in Bangladesh is the inversion of that. So if you are in any way, I mean, there's a new narrative emerging where the July monsoon revolution was a more significant revolution than 1971. So if you argue that actually 1971 was a significant moment in Bangladesh's history because the country was born then, you could potentially be in big trouble. And there's been lots of protests and debates by politicians in the House on both sides, because the parliament now has no left of centre representation. It's all people. It's the BNP who are on the right of centre. Then you've got the Jamaat who were persecuted by the Army League for many decades since the war, really. And then you've got this new students' party, the NCP, which claims to be a centrist party, which it is, but it is very socially conservative at the same time. And they've been very critical of the Army League's correct history. And they want to invert that back to, they want to say that the July Revolution was the most significant moment in the country's history. So if somebody like me, for example, was to write anything encouraging about the 71 Liberation War, I'd be in big trouble. And it's personal for me because, my father was a Maoist Naxalite. He fought in the 1971 war. He was in the jungles as a commander in that fight, but he was a Marxist socialist his entire life, and he wouldn't be very pleased with what the Army League ended up doing in Bangladesh, and he wouldn't be very pleased with what's happening right now, right? So then what do you do now? Is it going to get me into trouble even saying this now? I mean, if it does, it does. I mean, sometimes you've got to stand up to it. But so there are all sorts of complications. The British government and their hostile environment, which is their immigration policy, which has been running since 2014, I think, arguably before, don't believe. I mean, I should have mentioned this at the top, but I work as an expert witness, a country expert on Bangladesh for immigration asylum tribunals in the UK. And I've had hundreds of cases. I think to date, I've had about 450 cases from predominantly BNP and Jamaat dissidents. And for years and years and years, it's been an uphill struggle trying to convince the British government, the Home Office particularly, that cases of repression, clear-cut, evidenced repression, were, acts of persecution. These people could not return. They deserve refuge. And people have been just completely in stasis throughout the system. People have been waiting for years and years and years, developing all sorts of mental health problems. I mean, these people were subject to torture as well, so they already had mental health problems. And they didn't believe it. And lo and behold, as soon as the July Revolution happens, or the Monsoon Revolution, whatever you want to call it, happens, the British government changed tact, and now, it's, we made a mistake. But these people are still in a difficult situation. But now we have the other problem emerging. Now there's more Awami League cases coming now. Slowly, the Awami League cases are emerging. And I wonder what the current government will do now in collaboration with the British government to stop their cases from being heard. I mean, just on this point, I was yesterday before I came. I mean, this is why I turned up very late in Oxford last night. I was at the APPG for Bangladesh, and you had somebody presenting who'd looked into the enforced disappearances during the sort of 15 years. But the way that it was delivered was so partisan that it was suggested that enforced disappearances didn't happen before the Army League got to power, which of course it did. They were always in cahoots with the security services, the ruling parties. There were always people going missing. But But the whole tenor of the conversation, it seems right now emerging, and we had the current ambassador, who's the BNP guy, and the person who was appointed to investigate these enforced disappearances by the UNIS interim government. And their whole vendetta seems to be against the Awami League, which of course did horrific things when they were in power. That has to be made clear. But this is a structural issue in Bangladesh. It's not something which is, it's a party issue. It goes back to time. So I don't know if I've responded to the question. I would say another thing about British Muslims and the securitization that happens around them, which happens, prevent strategy, British policy towards that, and the repression towards people who have any kind of idea which doesn't fit a particular mold. In Britain, we have people who are, Salafists, Wahhabists, people are widely demonized. But the vast majority of Salafists, and I work with them for my doctoral work in Luton, are quietists. They're very, they're religiously, they're conservative, they're pro-monarchy, because they use, they're quite literalist in their interpretation of scriptures. So because the Christian king of Abyssinia granted asylum to Muhammad's followers before the Medina period when they were being persecuted in Mecca, Wahhabis is actually a mainstream Muslim position where you can live under a king anywhere in the world that allows you to practice your religion freely. But they're not allowed to practice their religion freely, it seems. I mean, in law they are, but I mean, there's all sorts of restrictions on what they can say. And if they do say something, then they're taken into prison. They're in category A prisons under terrorist charges. A lot of the times they're under remand. So, it's again, it's totally not a global south or north binary distinction. I think there's a wider, unilateral hegemony that's in operation, and whether or not we ever had free speech is maybe a discussion for another day. Thank you.
Thank you. Christopher, I wonder if I could pose to you a rather problematic question, I guess, because we've had, we need to acknowledge our positionality as a panel, I suppose. I mean, in this room, we're broadly speaking on the left of politics, some of us more so than others, but certainly, from sort of a liberal kind of position to a quite left-wing position, perhaps. And we've heard, sort of perspectives that, that can reflect, of course, our own political positionalities as well. We are, of course, here talking about academic freedom, and in that context, then, there are implications in terms of, the freedom to say whatever we want or to express whatever we want in an academic context. Even, of course, where those voices are perhaps voices that might make us feel very, very uncomfortable as academics, as individuals, as scholars, and so on. So, Christoph, I wonder if I could ask you to reflect a bit on, and you can do this in a fairly global context as well, but also perhaps bringing it back to your own sort of South Asian, kind of experience as a researcher as well, to think a little bit about how perhaps those discomforting voices, where they fit in this kind of dialogue around academic freedoms. It's a provocative question, but hopefully one that's useful to think on.
No, it's a difficult question indeed, but this is precisely where the beauty of academia lays. We are above, as academics, opinions. And the methodology we apply are the best guarantee for being that independently minded. Now, I always mention this anecdote. Many RSS leaders look at my book for knowing what is their history. Now, this is exactly what we are aiming at. We are not supposed to be uncomfortable with dissenting voices, because we are supposed to analyze all kinds of voices. And when we do fieldwork, we are not arguing with the people we interview. That would be ridiculous. We collect information, we collect data, and the methodology is, of course, impeccable. It can be ethnographic, it can be quantitative. This is why to fight for academia is so important, because this is the only way you can be non-partisan and make sure that you are a kind of reference, an anchorage point. What is the history of the country you are studying if it is written from one point of view? And this is exactly what we have to remain. We have to remain the anchorage points, the reference points. And it is why we have to make sure that, yes, we commit ourselves to cause, does not preclude the scientificity, the scholarship of our methodology. And that's the only life insurance we have. If we have, if we are cataloged, seen as using one angle, then we will not retain this respectability, this credibility. When we organize a panel these days, we better make sure that all kinds of voices are in a position to express themselves. Otherwise, it's very easy to dismiss the points we want to make by saying, oh, you are speaking from that angle only. It's new to us because we did not have to accommodate such a diverse number of voices. We were in between ourselves because for decades, well, at least in India, it was the case for decades. There was a center right. Now you have far right that claims to have ideas. Come, let's talk. What is the evidence? What is the methodology? And if we don't do that, I don't think we can regain the upper end academics used to have and are losing at the moment. And that's terrible. When countries do not respect their academics, they are shooting in their foot. And I would like to add with this, because we have not mentioned that so far. I would like just to add 2 points. One is, with the decline of academic freedom comes the decline of academia. All the countries losing academic freedoms are getting very low in all the rankings of universities. Social sciences, they may be good at computer sciences, I don't know. But I think in social sciences, if you lose academic freedom, you lose the quality of your teaching, research, and therefore you indeed shoot in your foot because you are not training the people the right way. The next generation will get the skills they need to develop the country. And that's exactly what we've seen in so many of Southern countries. And the point I would like to make, because we have not touched upon that too much, the private sector, the private universities are more and more powerful everywhere, including in South Asia. Many people thought they would protect academia because they were not part of the state apparatus. Of course, when you are a public university, you change the VC, you control UGC, you control ICSSR. Very easy. And by the way, I just mentioned by passing that these scholars of the CSDS in Delhi have not been paid their salaries since last July. Easy. You just stop paying people, they have to fall in line, or they have to lose their job. And it happens to CPR in Delhi, it happens to so many places. So some people thought, okay, the alternative is private universities. They're free, they're independent. Why should they be controlled by the government so easily? And to the big surprise, quote unquote, to many of us, they were even worse. At least in public universities, you have unions. At least in public universities, you have student unions, teachers' unions. In a private university like Ashoka University in India, just to name one, you have founders who are funders, who depend on the government for their own business so much that there is no way they can antagonize the rulers. And they fall in line even before. They anticipate, in fact, the criticism. And as a result, what do? They also replace VCs, and Pratap Bhanu Mehta had to leave his job because of his articles in Indian Express, which were seen as too critical. And after he left, Arvind Subramaniam, who was one of the stars, an economist in Ashoka, left by saying, oh, if there is so little academic freedom in Ashoka, I'm not going to stay. This is one example. There are so many other examples. So there is a need for the public and the private to join hands. I mean, the academics of the private and the public universities to join hands to resist this, and to resist what is also, when I keep the Indian example, but it applies to almost all the countries, the indigenization of knowledge, the Indian knowledge system that is now there in all the curricula is another form of obscurantism. Mm. It's another way to be ascientific. So it's not only, as we said, a top-down kind of authoritarian control of universities. It's also from the societal kind of influence ideologue are exerting, a transformation of what is the knowledge you transmit, and we see the list of books on the syllabi also shrinking in the same way, and again, the private and the public sectors have to fight this battle together.
Madhura, I wonder if I could come back to you again and maybe ask you to hone back into the Sri Lankan context. And again, sort of, I guess, kind of continuing something that Christopher sort of picked up on a bit there, this question of ethics and, ethics around kind of academic freedom and so on. And I wonder if I could ask you to extend that perhaps then into the context that you've already kind of articulated as being particularly problematic in all sorts of ways, but to think about questions of risk, questions of trauma, questions that extend that risk not just to us as academics conducting research or to academics in various parts of the world conducting research, but to also perhaps, people who participate in as, interlocutors, as informants, or however else we might articulate those kinds of roles in research against the background of this sort of discussion on academics.
Okay, so in terms of risk, not just to, ourselves as researchers doing the work, but to the people who we interact with, I can give sort of two examples, and they're quite personal, and it relates to my mother. So on account of her connection to me, and I think also to my husband, and we're both academics and have been activists and, written and spoken publicly on this issue. In 2012, while she was in Sri Lanka, she was visited by the security forces, the place she was staying, which is my aunt's house. And this, of course, this was at the height of the Rajapaksa era. It was 3 years after the end of the war. She was visited, my aunt's house was visited by the security forces on 2 occasions. She happened to be out on both occasions, which was good. And then she obviously, she left, and she was able to leave safely. So that was fine. But obviously my aunt is still there in Sri Lanka, and that risk continues, through these kind of network mapping activities. And then the second instance was I was on a Al Jazeera program, which is Mehdi Hassan's head-to-head interview with the former Sri Lankan president, Ranil Wickremesinghe. And I was one of the 3 panelists on that program, able to intervene. And that interview was obviously quite combative, as Mehdi Hassan's interviews always are. And it became something of a national political issue in Sri Lanka because the president really, it was quite clear that he didn't perhaps perform as well as he or his supporters would have liked him to. And the interventions of me and one of the other panelists who was on the show with me, Francis Harrison, were very critical of him. So after the interview aired, which was in February 2025, Ranil Wickremesinghe actually went on TV. He called a press conference in Sri Lanka where he sort of criticized me and Francis Harrison, the other panelist, who were very critical of him on a national kind of press conference. And this was reported in the national press in Sri Lanka. And once again, my mother was in Sri Lanka at the time. And so, as other members of my family, but the atmosphere had changed. And so they were not as anxious about it. And she was fine. She only knew that I had even been on this interview because one of the neighbors said that, "Oh, Ranil Wickremesinghe is on the news talking about your daughter. Do you know why?" And so she called me up to find out. And then when I went to Sri Lanka in August, my aunt sort of jokingly asked me, "Oh, are you going to go and visit Ranil?" And I checked with her first, like, "Are you okay with me coming to visit you? Do you want me to come and see you? Shall we leave it?" But she was quite insistent that I go, and she cooked all this amazing food, and it was really nice. So there's that sense of like that risk that comes, and it's a way of intimidating and silencing as well. And not everybody is as lucky as me to be able to somewhat withstand that and to have somewhat kind of like barriers of protection around that, which I do have, and not everybody else does have, right? So I think that it's about the people there, and it's sometimes in Sri Lanka, what also very often happens is that, which is also necessary work, if you interview people about disappearances, about the mass atrocity crimes, if you collect testimonials, all of that work is extremely high risk for the people involved themselves and for the people they interview. There's a lot of scrutiny, there's a lot of surveillance on that. And what very often happens is that the security forces will then visit the people that they have interviewed. And it depends on what the atmosphere is like, how much risk is involved in that, right? When political atmosphere context changes, there's slightly less risk as there is now, but it might be slightly kind of more risk, depending on what the government is like. And for example, in the years after the end of the war. But I think that the really important thing to note about all of this, about the way in which these kinds of curtailments of what can and cannot be researched, what can and cannot be said, what cannot be investigated, these restrictions on academic freedom and just kind of research freedom and reporting freedom, what it eventually gets to are these kind of epistemological silences or blind spots that then lead to the problem for social science is then that just leads to massive explanatory failures, right? So, for example, one of the things that you might have is that if you start to think about Sri Lanka as post-conflict, you make a set of kind of assumptions about it. But what that overlooks, and what some of the literature can overlook, is that Sri Lanka is intensely militarized in the former conflict zones, right? There's one soldier for every 12 civilians. This is extremely, extremely high. At the moment in Jaffna, there's a mass grave excavation, right? And 390 bodies have been discovered thus far, including several infants. It's not post, right? So that framing is likely to miss a lot of things that are going on and is not likely to have kind of very good predictive purchase on the future because it overlooks these things. And it's the same in other contexts. For example, there are, pressures on talking about, for example, caste, right? There's a lot of hostility to talking about caste in India at the moment. And there was a seminar or workshop at JNU that was like physically, violently broken up, which was discussing caste. But the problem is that caste isn't part of the material reality. It's part of the economic reality of India. And if you don't take it into account, you just can't explain specific outcomes that are important to explain from a social science sense. And so the thing I'll finish on is my like a friend and someone I've written with in the past, Mario Aroltas, he's just finished his PhD at SOAS, and it was really on the continuation of Tamil nationalism after the end of the war, despite a lot of expectations that it would end. And in the dissertation goes back to the literature from 2009-10 and the kind of near consensus that this was the end of this movement. This is the end of this social movement. This is just bare earth. Everybody's dead. It's going to now go into a kind of very quietist mode and people are just going to put up with whatever they're given. There's a very strong analytical expectation in 2009. And of course, that's not what turned out, right? There's been kind of incessant protest, incessant kind of, commemoration, incessant memorial, like this constant ongoing resistance activities that take multiple forms. And so what's important about that is not the normative. There is a normative question to that, obviously. But what's really important about that is that it's an analytical failure. And that analytical failure comes about because of blind spots epistemological, analytical blind spots and failures that have emerged as a consequence of these restrictions on investigation and analysis, academic over several decades.
Jivan, I wonder if I could bring you in here again, actually, because so far we've talked quite a lot about, I suppose, constraining pressures in various ways. But in the in the sort of context of the poll, we also, I suppose, have quite a lot of pushing pressures, let's say. There's a lot of kind of humanitarian focus on the poll. There's a lot of sort of development kind of focus from international development agencies and so on and so on. And I wonder if you could, give us a little bit of a sense of how these kinds of, kind of pushing forces almost, are a part also of shaping, academic freedom within the country.
Absolutely. And I think to set the context for this is, universities or academic setting in Nepal, as I mentioned previously, are not as advanced as in other contexts. So, for example, I would be surprising most of you here saying that there is no research, sort of dedicated research funding from UGC to academics in Nepal, and many of them rely on either international collaboration, which is purely seen as a way to get some resources to get work done, or relying on historically as being the kind of, the pet country for donors, development aid donors. So there's sort of, flooding of resources to academics from development agencies, very much sort of shaping the kind of research agenda, right? So if you have to look at, what lies beneath or behind academic freedom, resources, institutions and norms, and people, right? And funding resources is critical to this. We talk about sort of, silencing and so on. If certain topics, issues are researched and therefore others are excluded, right? Historically, the kind of the making of the academic in the first place, particularly in social sciences, what we've seen in Nepal, if you look at the kind of scholarship that has been produced, some of the best works, until recently have largely been produced by people from outside. Because as we as we talk about, Nepali researchers either became porters as collaborators, as research assistants, field researchers doing empirical work. Perhaps now, in the last 10, 15 years, included as co-authors or collaborators, previously just not even that, reduced to kind of footnote, right? Academics working in universities. I think things are changing, but at the same time, I think this is the sort of reality in which we sort of work in, right? So I think you're absolutely right to indicate that the availability, the only available sort of, major source of resources has been, funding for largely consulting kind of contract research, right? So it's a particular way in which research from development humanitarian agencies are contracted out to individuals or not necessarily to the university departments, to outfits that are outside, where academics do take part or are members. And that is how I think the academic field has been protected, you could say. I'm not using the negative word to kind of say it's been dismantled. It's also protected in the sense that whatever is possible has been sort of pursued through this particular model, right? And I think that what has really worked, I think in the context of Nepal until very recently, has been for me the we talk about in the in the Sri Lankan context, in Pakistani context, in the Indian context, we've been talking about the kind of the political kind of the big political context, which is sort of having an impact on whether dissenting voices are possible. In Nepal, I think I would say until recently, with the new Gen Z sort of movement and its sort of success into a new government, I think we are seeing similar sort of movement towards digital mobilization against dissenting voices and so on, which is just beginning. So I think what we've seen in other places, I would argue, is emanating, is appearing now. Otherwise, it's been vibrant. Issues have been discussed, not in the academic text necessarily or in journals, but in the newspapers, in the public sphere. Every single issue on caste, ethnicity, nationalism, language, gender, sexuality. And I think this is what I call the sort of the paradox, right? The kind of the context is very liberating, or has been. The substance, the institutional kind of the makeup has not been. And I think this has been made possible largely through this sort of, the mode of funding that academics relied on, which may not have made it to the making of the academic knowledge in the sense of journals, books, and so on, but has nonetheless contributed to the academic, to the public debate in Nepal, where it takes place in the pages of newspapers, in FM radio, kind of programs, discussion, programs, and so on. So I think we really need to kind of, to better understand the kind of academic freedom or academic context in Nepal. The way it operates, I think, is significantly different to that of, perhaps some similarities with similar perhaps in Bangladesh as well, some parallels, maybe a bit of parallel in Sri Lanka, but not necessarily like what we've seen in India, right? Very different in that sense.
Dineshwar, I'd like to come to yourself next. We've touched on a whole sort of scope of different areas. And I would like to ask you to think then about the question of sort of caste that you highlighted before, but to bring this now into the context not just of the university, but of the way in which the broader sort of systemic structures in India might reproduce forms of exclusion and inclusion around caste particularly.
Thank you very much, Tom. So, connecting to your question, so I'll just give a brief background. So, education was not open to the marginal sections like Dalits, rural tribes, so they are called tribe or Adivasis. So, in this context, the only gateway to the education for Dalits was the revisions of Jyotiba Phule, Savitribai Phule, then Periyar, and later on Ambedkar. And with a constitutional framework, it was try to give a space how they equate the society. So if we see the leveling of society or to maintain equity, so the path was chosen that giving an opportunity in educations. But education was denied to them since more than 3,500 years story. So coming from that background to claim a space in higher education, it's obviously difficult, but as we know, we have some sorts of provision, but who is like running that system? So let's say government, or maybe the university space where we see who are operating that system. So the reproduction of the caste here, it is coming again. So why I'm saying in case of reproduction of caste in the university space, because when the peoples are living in a society, so the hierarchy they have in the village society, but when they come to the university, so in this university setting, so they are facing a new form of hierarchical society. So if you go back to the argument of Ambedkar's division of labor, but here there is two distinction between the occupations as well as professions. Everyone wants to see the lead to be work in the occupations. It may be lower occupations, but when the lead claim in the space, in the educational space, maybe in research, maybe in teaching, so it is not tolerated by the dominant forces, those who are there. So the public psychology or the social psychology which are around the society, and that is continuously grown in a university atmosphere. If you go back the argument of Andrew and the Gupta saying, so the caste is no more in the society and specific in the university space. But through my research, and we try to conclude that it is very much existing in the university. Not only it is caste, it produced in a larger form. So it is in giant caste system which is propagated in the university systems. If you see recent 10 years of the history and data where the only space of education is allowing Dalit to entering that space through the 12th five-year plan, where there was an inclusion agenda, how we can include Dalits and tribes into the higher education space. But by practice, it is not accepted by the dominant force they are there. So they wanted Dalits to be in the lower graded jobs. And also, if you see not only the 10 years data, go back even further data. So there are a lot of suicides and also caste discriminations which discourage the leads to claim their space in higher education and to be reaching to the profession of the highest profession or maybe the sophisticated profession. So the watertight and airtight compartment of reaching to that profession is not allowing the leads in through public psychology or the social psychology which around or surrounding in the university space. So, recently, there was provision from the UGC, that is Equality Act, to be regulated in the university space. But the psychology, public psychology, or social psychology resist that. You may be seeing one country which is claiming to be the largest democracy, but at the same time, when people are demanding constitutional or maybe regulation safeguards for marginal peoples, but in that country, also people are in the road protesting, counter protest. Similar to here, there are peoples like far right groups. They just do counter protest. There are also people they object. There should be some equality provisions by the UGC, and even that is also pending in the Supreme Court with the fear of that this act may be misused or this regulation may be misused. If you considering the whole uh, psychology and the practice which is going to give a space to the Dalit in the university, so I can conclude that to claim a space of occupation for your livelihood is somehow tolerated, but when you try to leveling up them with the space where they called it sophisticated profession as education and teaching jobs is always not tolerated by the public or social psychology. Uh, Contextualizing this, if I say the Dalits, we have reservations for the Dalits and tribes. So in that sense, one way they're just claiming they are meritorious, but another way when a Dalit or tribe just securing or scoring the mark of open category mark, the panel think that so they're just categorizing the persons like this person is only 15% is for Dalit and they cannot go to the above even if they score.
Pritam, I wonder if I could come to you again here and again ask you to really sort of scale things up. Uh, um, Dinesh was very kindly giving us kind of a sense of those more sort of structural inequalities around caste and also around other sort of categories, Adivasi and so on, and started to highlight some of the forms of sort of structural violence that might be present there. But I wonder if I could ask you to scale that up even further and to think more about global economic and political processes, whether that be capitalism or other modes of inequality that produce not just differences, not just unequal relations, but also maybe perpetuating of issues around voice and academic freedom and so on.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. I would make basically 3 points. One, I want to refer to the structural crisis of capitalism on a global scale, which has implication for the rise of authoritarianism, both in the sort of global south and as well as global north, and its implications for academic freedom. Secondly, also I want to highlight some elements of resistance, which we didn't talk about. And I think those sites of resistance need to be celebrated and need to be remembered. And thirdly, I will link up with the diaspora, which not only the Punjabi diaspora, but the global diaspora, very, very briefly. Now, I think that though, of course, this needs a longer discussion. Part of the reason for the rise of authoritarianism, anti-immigration, and the kind of Trumpism, Modism, and Turkish authoritarianism is the crisis of global capitalism. That global capitalism in the post-Second World War period went through a period of growth, which allowed certain amount of freedom to discuss, debate, and it was confident capitalism. And right from the 1980s, with the rise of neoliberal economy, for a short period, global capitalism also had its play, the third wave, Blair and Clinton and so on and so forth. But since 2008, 2009, global capitalism is facing a serious crisis. And these crises are manifested in many, many different ways. So part of the reason behind this rise of authoritarianism is this: how to deal with this crisis. The profitability has gone down. The capacity to provide employment has gone down. The capacity to have public expenditure in the same scale as it happened has gone down. And this, I think, has direct implications on academic freedom in social sciences and humanities, because these are the fields where ideological battles take place, and therefore it is. I mean, I think it's true both of this country and in America that the greatest attack on academic freedom has come out in social sciences and humanities. It's in the departments of politics, history, anthropology, and religion, and so on and so forth. Not so much in physics, not so much in chemistry, not so much in biology, because capitalism needs those departments for innovations, and so that's one reason, which is also manifesting in developing countries also, that it is those departments which are being cut down. It's not that the social science, it's not the physical sciences and biological sciences which are being cut down. So all of us come from social sciences background, so we experience this. That's one thought I think need to be kept in mind in understanding, why there is an attack on academic freedom in social sciences and humanities more than in other fields, and therefore they will allow. You mentioned about AI and or you mentioned it, and but they will not allow the same kind of freedom in other areas. The other is that I think I know a little bit about Nepal and maybe a little bit about Sri Lanka, but certainly about India. There are many, and some in Pakistan as well, say Balochistan, and there have been sites of resistance. It's not all case of gloom and defeat. I will give just one or two examples to illustrate this point. One is that in India, the authoritarianism during Hindu nationalism had manifested in promotion of Hindi, because the old project of making India into one nation, and out of these multiple diversities. I mean, India is such a diverse country. There's no other country in the world which is as diverse as India. I mean, people from Kerala and Punjab can't speak any common language. There's no common. And similarly, there are other examples. And to deny that there are subnationality, to deny these linguistic identities, and to unify this country into one nation, which was also the Nehruvian project. So my work also criticizes Nehruvianism also from this, that the push towards centralization which took place during Nehruvian regime. And there were 2-3 instances. One, that BJP has actually accelerated this. So, promotion of Hindi everywhere, and also Sanskrit. In Karnataka, they started defacing all the signboards on railway stations, etc., which were written in Hindi in Karnataka. In Punjab University, where I taught, the Punjab University had only signs in English and Hindi. Students rose up in rebellion. They said the University of Punjab, and you don't have signboards in Punjabi. They defaced all of them, and the government had to back down. The university had to back down, and they did that. Also, that farmers' agitation was another important. That the food is such a critical item. The government could not afford to repress them in the way they could repress others. So therefore, eventually, they had to really had a humiliating defeat. Recently, there have been a series of strikes in North India, in Noida, and also in South India, in Western India, which is a new kind of industry of strikes, which are not the old political parties, the CPs, and so on and so forth. These are new generation of workers who are rising up in a revolt. So there are sites of resistance which need to be remembered. And why I'm saying this is that recently there has been a celebration, though it hasn't achieved as much media attention as it should, that February 26, there was a general strike in this country, a massive event of historical importance, and for days, workers, at least 9 successive days, they shut down the whole of Britain, and there was a possibility that there might be a revolution in this country, and so there was a celebration of that. And I was invited to speak at one of the platforms. So I spoke about the railway strike in India in 1974, whose crushing actually laid the rise of emergency in India, but also the re-emergence of these new sites of resistance which are merged as a part of the labor history. So I would think that when we think about the attack from authoritarian forces, we also need to remember these sites of resistance. The third point is about the diaspora, that global capitalism has allowed this migration and emergence of massive diaspora. There's no one single story about the diaspora. For example, looking at the Indian case, the Gujarati diaspora is enthusiastic supporter of the Hindutva project. But the Sikh diaspora, the Kashmiri diaspora, and the Dalit diaspora, they have been providing a huge support to dissident movements within Punjab, within Kashmir, and the various caste struggles. So there is that element also. We have a Punjab research group, and this is basically because many of the Punjabi academics, when they moved to this country or started doing research, they found that the bigger Punjab is actually in Pakistan. And so a feeling came that there's no one Punjab. There are 3 Punjabs. There's the Indian Punjab, there's the Pakistan Punjab, and the Punjabi global diaspora. And we need to all unite them together, and we need to transcend these territorial boundaries which have been created by colonialism and post-colonial states. So I think that the diaspora will increasingly play a very important role, and the state, because if there is a massive by Sikhs and Kashmiris and the Tamils, and the media picks it up. And the Indian government is very, very sensitive, and all governments are sensitive, national governments. So I think that's very important, and where we as an academics, we need to recognize this. Of course, there is a very interesting work on diaspora, but that tends to be about sending remittances and the contribution to this, but also the political resistance which diaspora can contribute. Thank you.
Thank you, Pritam. Maya, I wonder if I could come back to you, because we've had a long conversation, and I'm sure also reaching the end of our capacity to continue. But before we kind of, start to move towards wrapping things up, I wonder if I could just give you a bit of a free floor for a moment to sort of, come back in with a bit of a kind of purview of what's been discussed.
Yeah, so I think one of the important things that is a line through what has been said across some of the comments so far is hasn't directly asked or directly made the case or interrogated what is it that universities do for society. And I actually think that that's an important point that I want to just belabor for a moment, because it is important. It is in some ways importantly in tension with the way that governments who have come to power through elections, which is not the same thing as a democracy, they come to power and say, we represent the people, because we've just been elected to represent the people. So, we are legitimate in our efforts to undermine universities and academic freedom as a part of what universities do. So there is a tension there about, and I think I think we as academics have to be thinking about what is it that universities do for societies, and being able to tell societies that we're embedded in what is it that universities do. And universities are not meant to reflect public opinion, right? They're meant to critically test public opinion. And it's for that reason that when you get governments coming to power, as you have done in the United States, but also in India, saying that universities don't represent public opinion, that there's I think we should all be clear that they're not supposed to necessarily represent public opinion. They're meant to be laboratories of people who are critical of the systems, whether it's the system of capitalism, whether it's the systems of legitimation of power. At one time, the world and institutions of higher learning around the world said that the world was flat. And, it was by protecting people who were advancing alternative forms of knowledge, who were not silenced on critical areas of inquiry, that we got to a place where we understand the world differently, that has enabled all kinds of progress, shipping and so forth. And so I think we need to be able to also say, why is it that universities have this special place in societies? They do that because they are a place where critical views can probe and test public opinion. And I think that's just a really important thing to say, because there is this narrative out there that you don't represent, you're anti-national, and to say, that script can be very easily flipped to say, our forefathers fought for whether it was in 1971 in Bangladesh or whether in 1947 in India and Pakistan, right? The right to have our own sense of who we the people are, and that is what we're picking up. It's that inheritance, and so I think that this matters not only for understanding conceptually what a university does, but also what the response is for protecting academic freedom. So, one country we haven't talked about, another point I want to raise is Afghanistan. And it's the only country in South Asia that is very consistently rated as, not free. So all other countries in South Asia that we've talked about are in this liminal category of hybrid, according to the various watchdogs that look at levels of democracy. And then, this is important because there are varying degrees of academic freedom. And there's a reason that we are all able to have this debate here in the UK, though this isn't perfect. It would be very hard, I think, to have this debate today in India or in Pakistan or in Bangladesh and any, the countries that are under discussion. And I think, Afghanistan is a case of where, fully half of the population has really been excluded from participation in all kinds of spheres of public life. But what we are seeing across most South Asian contexts beyond Afghanistan is that the forms of exclusion are much more subtle and much more difficult to really call out, because they involve like intricacies of funding and appointment and legal harassment that could be legitimate but is often weaponized, right? So I guess those are the last point I want to make is that the most significant threat, I think, that runs through all of the cases that we've talked about is a sense of self-censorship that comes from academics in environments where there are these subtle forms of pressure, and they all stack. They all accumulate. If you're nervous that you're going to get investigated for tax fraud in some way, and you're nervous that you're going to get called into the vice chancellor's office, then often that's a more effective way to stifle and chill speech than to actually have a red line. Because if you have a red line, then interestingly, people know how to go up to the red line, but not to cross it. But if you have this kind of generalized sense of fear and dissent, then that's really difficult because you never quite know when you cross the line.
Maya, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think the red line analogy is an important one because, even where there is a red line as well, it also gives people kind of a rallying point, right? This is something we can now push against, actively push against and target. But when it's much more ambiguous and insidious and sort of covert in these ways, then it's much harder to do that. So we are going to wrap up, but just as we do, I want to give everyone, and I really mean 30 seconds, to just give us a little sort of final thought from each of you on how do we move forward? And that could relate to your particular context. It could be broader, but really just 30 seconds because we are, kind of out of time on things. Could I start with you, Madhura, and we'll just sort of work our way around?
So very quickly, I think we need to tell stories everywhere, really, about the value of universities and the value of pluralism. I live in Northwest London. I don't follow football, but many of my friends and my relatives do. They're big Arsenal fans. And honor of Arsenal's recent win, Arsenal had an amazing slogan, which is Arsenal is a home for everyone, right? And I think that universities can do that, saying that, intellectually, we should be homes for everyone. Yes.
I'll quickly make 2 points. First is that universities should be okay with dissent, disagreement, and discomfort. And also, it is the university's responsibility to protect its students and its academics. So, it was the university's responsibility to protect Junaid Hafiz from getting lynched. It is Columbia University's responsibility to protect its students from state repression rather than giving their names to the state machinery. It was SOAS's responsibility to protect its students rather than suspending them. And my second point is that repression on academic freedom happens because of lack of tolerance. Tolerance is bred through education, which plays a pivotal role. And history, especially, plays a very important role here. History needs to be taught in schools in all its glory and all its horror, which means that British schools need to teach children about the Jallianwala Bagh incident. Pakistani history needs to be taught in a way that what happened into East Pakistan and the formation of Bangladesh is truly taught. India should be talking about Gujarat under Modi. And if Israel had taught its students about the Nakba, I don't think we would have been in this situation in the first place. Instead, they were talking to their students about the land as if no one existed there before they came. So the multiplicity of perspectives in the way students are taught in our education is extremely, extremely important for then there to be academic freedom in the future.
Thank you. I also want to make only 2 points. One about this idea the university should be free and it's in an atmosphere of freedom and innovations take place and development take place. Now, just an opposite view, that this view was posed to some of the BJP functionaries, that you are attacking the internationally renowned economists, historians, sociologists who are left wing. It's not good, and people who support you are mediocre. They said, we know that. We know that the people who support us are mediocre, but we want to fill these universities with mediocre people who will support our ideologies. So we don't care about the international reputation and the innovation and the great knowledge. So the ruling classes have different conceptions of universities. That's why resistance is important. And on fear, my view is that people are more afraid than what can be done to them. And as you mentioned, that those red lines can be crossed. It has happened with me several times. That, and because I have gone through a crisis, I've come out of victorious out of that. I have learned that you can walk quite a mile and no one will be able to threaten you. And that point where there will be some resistance is probably very far off, but you stop too soon. And therefore we need to also build a culture of trying to transcend fear and not become a victim and slave to the fear which the ruling groups want to impose upon us. Thank you.
Yeah, just 2 points. I think one, something that I made earlier, the question of financing of universities remains central. Governments are the ones who are actually financing, and we've seen manipulation of that in different ways. And I think, some kind of, constitutional intervention might be something that, conversations could lead to, I think. The other one, I think, which I've been inspired by, other colleagues sort of, bringing this, the sort of threat from below. And I think it gets even more challenging with the use of, social and digital media, where the threat is coming from unknown, kind of, which is extremely difficult to address, even through any form of dissent. What kind of what is dissent going to do? How is it going to really tackle this? Because we don't really know where is it emanating from. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. So, I mean, it's very difficult not to be cynical and hopeless in this situation. So I've tried to find out. I mean, essentially, in both my fieldwork contexts, whether it's the UK or Bangladesh, there's an obsession with the politicization of correct speech, or what is considered the right thing to say or think about a particular issue. In Bangladesh, I mean, I come back to Larry's point earlier on, where we have outrage, blasphemy-based outrage. And it's not just Muslims, because the Hindus a lot of the times come out on the streets because they feel that something's been desecrated. But where does where does that outrage come from, right? And if you think about, I don't know, if you look into the histories of Islamic epistemology, it's always been a vibrant space. Well, in the classic period, the so-called golden period, on any given street in Baghdad, you had 20 different views on how to pray, right? And that was celebrated. So how did we get from that to, no, there's only this way of being Muslim, or, So, I'm certain that modernity's got something to do with it. I'm certain that capitalism's got something to do with it. But then it effectively becomes the management of outrage. And how do we go about doing that? In the UK context, similar thing. I mean, I think to criticize Israel now is almost blasphemous, and it comes from top down. So even though I take the point that there's a bottom up purge, if you like, but these discourses emanate from somewhere, and universities are supposed to be the places where they come from. But actually, you get lots of misinformation and educational lack peddled by politicians and powerful stakeholders like Elon Musk and all the other people that create these kinds of discourses. I mean, we've got to the absurd position in British civil society where Jews are being accused of of anti-Semitism and being purged from the Labour Party. And then, the denial at the same time, the denial of Islamophobia, the criminalization of protest. So I think I mean, again, I agree with Lorraine, but I think it goes back to good education. How do we educate people? How do, these guys who are lynching people in Pakistan or in Bangladesh, do they know that, do they know their history? Do they know, the intellectual, long and rich and globally celebrated intellectual tradition of Islam? Do they know these things? I doubt that they do. Do people know about the Balfour, Declaration? Do they know about the origin of? Do they know that there were Jews there before? That there was a place called Palestine? People don't know, and I think universities have a massive responsibility to keep that going. I have to say, the fact that we're all together and we're talking about these things, there is a bit of hope, right? Because there's lots of people who are talking about these things, and we can speak to our students and we can speak to other colleagues, and we can have a ripple effect. But I'm afraid this is, it's a glimmer of hope amongst a huge sea of despair that I see at the moment. And I'm sorry to finish on that note.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just wrapping up my thoughts, if I say the issue, the threat, the challenges the Dalits in the academia they face. Those who are working on caste, they are facing a generic threat. And again, those who are insiders and they are working on caste, they are supposed to be multiple threats. Threats in terms of not getting job, their thesis will not accepted. One of my respondent, he said his thesis was also not accepted because of he raised issue on caste in a radical way, and one of the evaluator not accepted that idea, and placing the Dalit to more vulnerable in that way. So my suggestion is that when we see, if we just compare Ambedkar when he was studying and drafting the constitutions and raising several movements for the rights of Dalit, he has also significantly is a number of challenges, but he chose the middle path. At the same time, he tried to hold on the people, those who are trying to restrict as a dominant force in India, as well as he built himself theoretically as well as legally how to tackle the issues. So if I go to his idea of getting a way out from these situations, so his famous quote is educate, agitate, organize, and agitate. So in this quote, so education is the main pillar which try to give a space to the Dalit to equate in the society. But if I say organize, how the Dalit organize? So organize in a systematic manner will really bring some hope and change in the society. If I just say one of the examples where one of my respondent, so he was awarded to getting scholarship to study abroad, but due to institutional challenges from the government as well as from the university, so his fellowship was suspended. But how we organized, how the people organized from those who are from below. So they filed a case in the Delhi High Court, and fortunately, they win that case against the central government, the Union government. So when you, and in that case, the peoples from the Dalit background or Ambedkarite movements, they supported both financially and morally, and how to fight against a giant government who is like a force of suppressing the movement as well as recognizing rules in a particular way. So I think, yeah, so getting into the organized in a well manner and supporting each other, so that can really help and resolve the issue. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a rich and really fascinating discussion. We could, of course, continue on, but there I think we really do need to wrap things up. So it just remains me to say Madhura, Ashraf, Jivan, Daneshwar, Lareb, Pritam, Christoph and Maya, thank you so much for your fascinating contributions. And I'm sure this is a discussion and debate that hopefully will continue forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
To read our full articles or to submit an article, please search Contemporary South Asia Journal and visit our web pages. It would also be a tremendous help if you could like, share and subscribe to this podcast to increase our visibility. Many thanks.